and I've had to adapt it for a more traditional form. So you're not going to get everything on there, but it does have the website where the original is located. If you end up being really interested in what I'm talking about today, you can go there and explore it. I will leave, one part of it for my presentation today because I intended it to be a true hypertext and that you could go to different places and do different things with it. So, cultural migration and appropriation through visual media, anime is a carrier of socially constructed culture. I think in the future we're going to be shortcuts. When Japanese anime migrated to the U.S. in the 80s, companies simply copied and reproduced minimum quantities of the Japanese version. However, this method of reproduction changed when anime became popular in the 90s. U.S. producers were concerned that TV viewers would see these cartoons as detrimental to children because of some of the topics presented in the shows: there's death, religion, gender identity, and sexuality. So the producers and directors edited out parts of the anime and rewrote the vocal script for the voice actors. This led to anime that reflected U.S. culture and not the Japanese culture of its origins, creating a text that was not a simple migration, translation, and voiceover, but a text that appropriated Japanese art to transmit U.S. cultural values. However, having seen some of the original versions the anime produced, U.S. audiences wanted the originals. Due to the extraordinary amounts of cuts and alterations in the U.S. versions, older fans of the show purchased the anime in Japanese and began to subtitle it. Thus, fan subs were created, if you ever wanted to know what that meant. The disconnection among anime audiences caused by the U.S. cultural adaptation created two distinct imagined communities. One that consciously or subconsciously accepted the U.S. translation because they needed a text in their own language, so the dubbers. And one that identified with the Japanese originals but needed language translation, were called subbers or purists. Each community merged aspects of their favorite anime into their identities, both group and individual. These socially constructed communities fought for the self that they created from their versions of anime, making anime a negotiated space where people find limitless depictions of self to identify with. Identities that are then accepted by the imagined community. From this conflict, the dub versus sub war developed. The current discussion investigates the war between the purists and the dubbers to explore some of the social and cultural aspects promoted and cut in the shift from Japan to the U.S. I will use excerpts from Sailor Moon because it was my baby, I loved it. This will include a look at the intended audience and the actual audience in both cultures. The intent is to explore the effects of alteration on visual media, visual media on different cultural populations based on cultural and societal expectations versus actual audience preferences. The basis of this study is the examination of the changes made to the original anime from Japan and the cultural and social effects of anime on U.S. audiences. Social construction theory works from the foundation that society constructs knowledge and artifacts. Adani and May in 1984 described the process of constructing reality by noting the move from a person's internal ideas, memories of the self and the world, which are subjective, to the expression of those ideas in the real world. Through this process, people are both the creator and the outcome of their beliefs, and this process can only be completed by interaction with others. With anime, society constructs the form of animation that is presented to the audiences, thus giving symbolic input for the construction process. As anime travels to the U.S., producers have to decide what values will be presented to the audience, usually making these decisions based on the dominant ideology of society. However, not all audiences receive these messages the same. Gamson Coteau, Boys and Sass in 1992, comments that audiences of visual media play a role in negotiating the meanings of images. If individuals do not like the message that is being sent, they begin to renegotiate with the message, so no audience is homogeneous. Hill 2004 states that it is important for people to understand the ways in which media help us define our individual roles within society. Media transmits various roles to be internalized, and from these available roles, individuals construct their identities through negotiation, either assimilating or rejecting the presented identities and seeking other versions of self through different media. Adani in May 1984 defines the role of media in the reality construction process as facilitating an interaction between individuals, society, and culture, which is why a dubbing or a subbing of the story would make a substantial difference in identity creation. There are many people who identify with the U.S. rendering, so this is their version itself or close to it. But there are just as many people who reject the U.S. creation. These people identify with the Japanese originals, and theirs are conflict. To explore the effects of social construction on anime, an analysis using a rhetorical focus on audience is vital. As Hill 2004 observes, we are a largely visual society, and many of our powerful cultural concepts are encoded within easily recognizable images. It is through images that the media affects their audience. For this reason, understanding that images in media are rhetorical is important. Hill 2004 continues by explaining how images affect viewers. Objects or ideas that are pictured or represented in concrete visual terms are given added presence, thereby becoming more real to the reader, the viewer. This is the reason that people fall in love with their favorite actor, want to live in fabulous imaginary worlds, play video games to represent their interests, or go to theme park rides about their favorite movies. Want some proof? In Downton Abbey, do you hate or love Edith Crawley? Are you Team Jacob or Team Edward? When Dumbledore died in the movie, what was your reaction? Taking the ideas of rhetoric and looking at how they apply to current media, specifically in the area of audience, is crucial to this study. Audiences identify with their favorite anime characters for the same reason people identify with actors. For this analysis, I focused on Sailor Moon, utilizing a user analysis and content analysis to provide evidence for theoretical suppositions. Towards this purpose, I used Kenny 2004's idea of depiction as a basis for methodology. The user analysis focuses on multiple audiences, both intended and actual, of the anime Sailor Moon. Because as Kenny notes, rhetorical critics generally focus on the context of production, and they generally pay little attention to how people receive the message. In order to discover the producer's intended audience, a simple audience analysis will focus on two aspects: the time it aired, revealing the age group of the target audience, and genre conventions, revealing identity aspects of the target audience. In conjunction with the method of depiction, the focus is on the intended and actual audience of the anime, because this is believed to be the point from which conflict stems. The content analysis will examine actual changes made to Sailor Moon based on the social assumptions of U.S. producers, directors, and scriptwriters. This evidence is explored in conjunction with the chosen theories to reveal a clear understanding of the dub versus sub war. In his dialogue, Kenny 2004 describes the process of depiction, and that's the first arrow on y'all's handout there, which contains 5 aspects. You have presentation, anticipation of feeling, facilitation of identification, application of identification, and then reaffirmation of identity. These 5 levels or steps explains how an individual moves from seeing an image to identifying with that image. To analyze the level of identification, a modified version of Kenny 2004 will be used, reflecting the ideas of depiction. And those are the next boxes there. I show his original on the left, it should be your left. The right is the ones that I changed and kind of how they move together. These 3 steps are identified as proposed identity communicated in the image, assessment of how well that identity is communicated, and evaluation of the legitimacy of that identity. This method will be useful in discovering how each audience either affirmed or rejected the U.S. presentation of a socially constructed identity. For the user analysis, looking at the target Japanese audience can be extrapolated by looking at the time the episodes were aired and the genre conventions of the anime. In Japan, Sailor Moon was aired on TV, and I always mess this up, Asahi, at 7 p.m. on Saturdays from March 7, 1992 to February 27, 1993. In Japan, this was a primetime show. A wide variety of audiences were available at that time, including children, young adults, and adults. To further narrow the audience down, it is important to look at the genre of the anime. Sailor Moon is considered a shoujo anime. Shoujo translated into English means girls, specifically a maiden or a young girl. So we're looking in the teens, in the upper teens. This then narrows the audience of the Japanese version of Sailor Moon to girls between the approximate ages of 10 to 16 that identify with girl heroes fighting for love and justice and are available at 7 p.m. on a Saturday evening. While this might seem unlikely for a U.S. audience, girls within this age group being home during prime time on Saturday is normal for traditional Japanese culture. It's more family-oriented. The target U.S. audience can also be extrapolated by looking at the time the episodes were aired and the genre conventions. In the U.S., Sailor Moon was aired on syndication channels and then on Cartoon Network at 9 a.m. and 2 p.m. In the U.S., this was a child's cartoon situated for small children that do not go to school or for children released from school by 2 p.m. Because its genre shifted to cartoon in the U.S., Sailor Moon became a child's superhero cartoon, not necessarily for young girls, although being girl-oriented, it kind of moved in that direction. The U.S. version of Sailor Moon resituated the audience as young children between the approximate ages of 4 to 7, available at 9 a.m. or 2 p.m. during the work week. And this is a large deviation from the original audience. For the content analysis, I'm going to focus on this one specific change. This is just one of the hundreds of changes made by the U.S. producers. MovieCensorship.com breaks down each change by episode. If you're actually curious and looking at all the changes, it goes literally like time by time in these things. It's fabulous. The scene for this analysis is the death scene of Zoisite in episode 31-35. The first number that I told you represents the U.S. designation, and the second is Japanese. So it was our episode 31 and Japanese episode 35. It gives you an idea of how much cuts were done. You do have on the sheet the characters on the back, and I'm going to say their names differently for the English and the Japanese, so that kind of gives you an idea of where I'm going. This is the episode where Sailor Moon defeats Zoisite, causing Queen Beryl to kill Zoisite. And so I'd say for evidence, here we go. The cut section from this episode is in English and Japanese. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you both of them. They're kind of short. I can find where the arrow is.
Zoisite, I'm so sorry. It's not fair. Queen Beryl should have punished me for not teaching you to be more patient. I'm so sorry I failed you.
Hold me. Oh, the only one who failed was me, Malachite. You told me not to seek revenge, but I didn't listen. Promise. Just promise me one last thing, Malachite.
Anything.
Don't forget me.
I would never. Goodbye, my love.
Okay, so that was the American version, and you could tell that one was only 44 seconds. The Japanese version is 1:15. That just kind of gives you some more ideas.
すまん、ゾイサイト。クイーンベリー様にお前の復活を頼もうとしたんだな。私は喜んでおりますが、あなたに見取られて死ねるんですもの。でも、最後のお願いを聞いてください。なんだ。私、きれいに死にたい。きれい、嬉しいくんさいと様、お慕いしておりました。くんさいと様。許せ、ゾイサイト。
Those are just specific cuts of the death scene itself. So in the English version, Zoisite is female. She's in love with Malachite and wants to die in his arms, supporting a heteronormal relationship. However, in the Japanese version, Zoisite is male and in love with Kunzite. At his death, Zoisite wants to die beautifully in Kunzite's arms, which Kunzite accomplishes with his power. Those petals in the first one were for effect, but in the second one, those were actually the transformation of Zoisite into flowers to be beautiful. So there are two aspects of this section that caused the U.S. producers to make changes. In the beginning of the Japanese version, which wasn't in this one, I had a previous one, it was there. Zoisite is blasted by Queen Beryl and lies in a smoking heap. And by that I mean a smoking heap of person. It's violent. This was cut for the U.S. version for violence. The second change was making Zoisite a female. U.S. producers deemed a homosexual relationship not appropriate for children, even though there are many heterosexual relationships in the show. So that shows that they took it out specifically because it was a homosexual relationship. So U.S. producers decided their audience of children was not ready for violence, death, and non-heterosexual relationships. So using those 3 steps for identity analysis, identification of proposed identity, assessment of how well that identity is communicated, and evaluation of the legitimacy of the identity on this theme specifically, reveals that the proposed identity for the U.S. audience is one where homosexual relationships do not exist or are not socially allowed. Assessing how that identity is communicated finds that the cuts wipe out any mention of homosexuality in Sailor Moon, and it's not just in the first season, I mean, this is through the whole series. So to accomplish their purpose, the U.S. producers did well. Evaluation of the legitimacy of that identity from a 2013 perspective, which is when I wrote this, shows that the identity is less socially accepted now. Currently, there's a large fight for equal rights no matter your sexuality, and the removal of these relationships in entertainment media is generally not accepted. People really get an uproar about it. However, in the 90s, for the U.S. majority, homosexuality was not a culturally accepted identity. It was still kind of one that was negotiated, but it was more hidden. The U.S. target audience affirmed that the exclusion of homosexual relationships was normal because they purchased the cut versions of Sailor Moon. So parents bought this for their children. What do all the cuts and additions and changes mean? So for audience, the changes in the target audience are the most profound change, which facilitated all the other alterations. Moving from a more mature audience ranging from approximately 10 to 16 years old in the Japanese version to children approximately 4 to 7 years old in the U.S. version was the basis for the cuts for violence and the deaths of characters. For the U.S. culture, or for U.S. culture, childhood is the age of innocence and knowledge of life facts are not taught to children until they're older. The other alteration, zoocyte's transformation from male to female, has to do with general U.S. homophobia. Though there are many people who are not homophobic, in the 90s, the country as a whole still had not accepted non-heteronormal relationships, which is reflected in the relationships presented in Sailor Moon. So looking at the content analysis for identity shows that the changes that were made were accepted in the 90s because the target audience was children. The cultural values that were being transmitted were acceptable to the audience, parents and children. This audience added these ideas to their identity. However, many U.S. teens and adults, me included, having seen or found information about the original, cried out for the original versions of the anime in a medium they could understand. These versions, the fan subs that I talked about earlier, passed from fan to fan by means of a sort of underground, or through internet exchange. From the original, many people, old, young, male and female, find aspects of identity that they associated with themselves, such as a lack of fear of homosexual relationships, the maturity to handle a more complex heroine that can die, and a better understanding of the emotions surrounding the violence in Sailor Moon. And those are personal things I found from the show. Viewers identified with the depiction of a scared crybaby that saves the world using love and justice. However, there were still many children who would grow up with the U.S. version, which affected the relationships between people who prefer the dub version and people who prefer the sub version. And then looking at how this kind of comes together, what does this mean for these communities? Mary Louise Pratt, in 1991, discusses the idea of the contact zone, where communities meet, collide, and negotiate their identities. She reflects on a statement that Benedict Anderson made. Human communities exist as imagined entities from which people will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or ever hear of them, yet in the minds of each lives the image of their communion. Communities are distinguished not by their falsity or their genuineness, but by the style in which they are imagined. This is the context of the dub versus sub war in anime communities. The disconnection created by the U.S. producers of anime among audiences, as exemplified by Sailor Moon, generated 2 distinct imagined communities. One that accepted the U.S. cultural creation or ignored the changes because they needed a version of their own language, a version in their own language, so the dubs. And one that identified with the Japanese characteristics but wanted to know what the characters were saying, the purists. These 2 communities met in the push for more anime in the U.S. These communities collided on internet blogs, forums, and polls. They argued at conventions and in neighborhoods across the U.S. Each tried to present the depiction or image of self that they created from their version of anime as a better choice. Thus, the communities were constantly in conflict and negotiation. Even in the present, this war continues and has spread to other translated media, such as music and video games. Anime creates social reality through inclusion, deletion, and change. These aspects translate themselves into elements of identity that people accept or deny, which leads to created communities. If we look at anime as a contact zone between imagined communities, then we can see the conflict and negotiation that Pratt 1991 discusses. Anime has vast and varied audiences facilitated by globalization. It is important to understand the aspects of anime that cause a conflict and negotiation among its audiences and the effect of adaptations of these media. Because contact zones are constantly in flux, as are the identities they affect, Anime is a zone where a variety of people can find depictions to identify with, and these created identities are accepted by the constructed community. The transmitted culture that causes the conflict and negotiation among audiences and the effects of adaptations of these media on identity creation are important because these shaped groups transcend individual cultures and create new subcultures. Different because of what the members bring in, but similar in the activities and stories that members participate in. These really are globalized societies. Anime is a negotiated space where people can find the limitless depictions of self to identify with. The conflicts reveal the strengths of these created globalized communities separate from their physical location. The importance of this understanding is in recognizing the reason behind the popularity of anime among people who are creating their identities. These are the reasons that people all over the world love anime. And just so you know how many people all over the world, the very last list on your sheet tells that's all of the places that Sailor Moon has been translated, either dubbed or subtitled in. So, there you go.